We are here today with Christina West and Chris Rodgers, and thank you both for joining us. We are going to talk about their work that is in figuring space. Come on in, Tunde. Don't worry. Yeah, Figuring Space is supported by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Roots Foundation for the Arts. The exhibition presents full-scale figurative sculptures in clay by the top artists working in the United States. Dr. Kelly Morgan, professor of the practice at Tufts University, added her integral knowledge of the historical use of the figure in American art over the last 200 years to deepen our usual focus here at the Clay Studio on contemporary art. This group of powerful full-scale representations of the human figure serve as a body of evidence to lay bare the issues that permeate American art and social culture. Each of the artists chosen uses the figure to usurp the sometimes painful history of bodies on display in American history. They assert their autonomy and subjectivity by presenting cultural critiques through lenses of their own choosing: race, gender, class, and anti-war ideas. Roberto Lugo, Kensuke Yamada, Cristina Cordova, Chris Rodgers, Sergei Isipov, Cristina A. West, Tip Tolan, Jonathan Christensen Caraballo, George Rodriguez, Roxanne Svensel, and Kunming Park were invited to participate. We recognize that the Clay Studio stands on the indigenous territory known as Lenapehoking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape people. We would like to take a moment to reflect on the role of the Lenape as the past, present, and future stewards of the land, and the role of all of us to join in their tradition of respect and caring for the land and each other. I recently visited the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and I encourage all of you to both visit or look on their website. There's a wealth of information for everyone who wants to learn more. And now I will introduce Cristina and Chris. Cristina A. West is a sculptor and installation artist who has extensively exhibited her work across the country in venues such as the Mattress Factory, the Everson Museum of Art, the Contemporary Arts Center in Buffalo, Pug Projects in Kansas City, and Atlanta Contemporary. Additionally, West's work has been supported by grants and fellowships from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Archie Bray Foundation, the National Council on Education and Ceramic Arts, and the Virginia Groot Foundation. West earned her MFA from Alfred University in 2006, her BFA from Siena Heights University in 2003. Until recently, West lived in Atlanta, where she was an associate professor of art at Georgia State University. And in 2022, she relocated to Madison, Wisconsin to join the art faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks for joining us, Christina. Chris M. Rodgers is a native of Charleston, West Virginia. He earned his BA from West Virginia State University, spent several years teaching English in Beijing, China, before continuing his education at Tainan National University of the Arts in Taiwan. He earned his MFA at the University of Arkansas in the spring of 2019. Rodgers most recently attended several artist residency programs, including Credit Rome, Watershed, Oxbow, and Casa Lu.
It's in Tlapan, Mexico City.
Thank you. And is now currently a resident artist here at the Clay Studio, and he was awarded the Governor's Purchase Award at the 2019 West Virginia Juried Exhibition. Okay, now I'm going to ask each of you the question I ask everyone, which is, how and why did you make the brave decision to make your life in art? And I'm going to start with Christina.
All right. Well, I know that the question is kind of open-ended, and this isn't necessarily implied in the question itself, but when I hear that, I often feel like it's asking for like a moment when like something like a switch flipped, like a moment when I was like, okay, this is exactly what I'm going to do. And I feel like it wasn't really a one-time decision, but more like a decision that I just keep making over time. And it's a decision that, I return to maybe more seriously or more earnestly at different periods, depending on how I'm feeling, so like the amount of time that elapses between me questioning if this is the right thing that I should be doing has grown longer. Like there's more time between those points, but they still definitely happen. Like there's still periods where I look longingly at other professions. Like I'll be at the dentist and be like, I don't know, maybe I could have done that. Like they make molds, it's kind of sculptural. And about 10 years ago, I was feeling very defeated because I was getting a lot of rejection for just external things I was applying for, as we all do, grants, shows, and just like the barrage of rejection had me seriously questioning if I should go back to school for something else. But then when I just looked hard at it, and even with all this rejection from these external factors, what it came down to is that the engagement that I experienced in the studio with like the problem solving with matter and space and the conceptual ruminations that I'm allowed to have as an artist, they are what I love to do. And that ultimately, I'm very privileged to be able to spend my life doing that. And so, I keep choosing to stay with it, largely because of that. And I think, I gravitated towards visual art in particular, because I've never been real comfortable communicating with language. So, even though it's difficult, I enjoy the process of writing and learning to articulate thoughts, but there's always like a part of me that's disappointed with language, so I can write something and feel like I've clarified my thoughts to some degree, but in that clarification, it's also narrowed my ideas a little bit. It's kind of maybe even oversimplified them. So it's like taking away all the messy contradictions that are floating around in my head that make them more interesting. So I really love with visual art the way that it can just present these questions that I feel like more accurately convey that kind of messiness and contradictions that are part of our experience. And I was thinking about this recently because here at Madison, we have this exercise that we do with our grad students where at the end of their second year, their committee each formulates a question for them that they have to respond to at length. And it's a question that isn't just like a simple answer, but they have to reflect on their work in relation to other things and compare and contrast. And it's almost like directing a thesis paper of sorts. And those questions are so compelling to me. Like formulating the questions is one of the most exciting parts of the job here. And reading the other faculty's questions is just super exciting. Like, oh, they could go this way with it and that way with it, or maybe they'll say this. And then it's always a little disappointing to read the actual answer. And it's the questions that I'm most interested in. And so I think that sort of was a good analogy for me of why I'm drawn to art.
Because it allows you to ask questions, and you're able to ask them to visitors who you engage with personally, and also people who you'll never see, which is kind of exciting.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
And they can have their own response, or they can make up their own question too, based on whatever your work is.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes there's
questions.
opportunity. Yeah. Sometimes there's opportunity to continue the conversation in person with language. And sometimes it's more like conversation over time with other artists, seeing the way their work has perhaps responded to something that you're also responding to.
Well, and that's perfect for our pairing today, because I think you're both thinking about, well, at least addressing questions with the same vocabulary in mind. But thank you, that was excellent. And a lot of people answer that way, the seed of what you were saying. Of course, your larger answer was very elegant, but I will say a lot of people acknowledge that you kind of have to make the decision all the time, which is true for anyone in life. If you're doing something, you kind of have to wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm gonna go do this thing with a smile on my face, or I'm not gonna do it anymore. So
Right. Or
Intentionality is something that we don't always remember. We have agency over our lives, even if you feel like you don't, like you really do have to decide.
right. When I think it's easy for our goals to be distorted, you know, by external pressures.
Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
a mortgage. Okay, thank you. And now we're gonna ask Chris. He wants to answer. I don't know where you want to look, but
I'm probably gonna just look at the room. It's
Look.
easier for me to look at the people.
that's fine.
Yeah. So I actually graduated from my undergraduate program 10 years ago this spring, and I've been thinking a lot about that time of growth that's happened since then. And I kind of stumbled into ceramics by chance. I was actually studying printmaking and painting. And in my last year, I went in and I thought, okay, I'll take a ceramics class. There was no sculpture. So it was my first time working three-dimensionally. And I actually really did not enjoy it at all until towards the end, where I started to experiment with glazes. And I felt like I had really discovered something. You open the kiln, you do all of this glaze research, and then you get one jewel out of, a dozen rocks or 100 rocks or whatever. And so there was this moment of like, oh, there's something here that I would like to continue to actually explore. And so I took an extra year in my undergrad program, just focusing on ceramics and working full time, and really beginning to just see what's possible with this material. And I began to realize that working three-dimensionally, like working with my hands and the immediacy that clay provides, the impact that you can put on it, how that's frozen in the material, was really important and significant for me. And I think that's why many people decide to work with clay. And like many artists or people who are young, I realized like I had to just do other things. I had to try other things. And so going to Beijing and spending that year, I wasn't making art at all. And I realized that during that time that it was art that I really wanted to focus on. And no matter what, I was going to find a way to continue. And so through these past 10 years, I would bounce around. I did a post-bac, I went to grad school, I studied abroad some, but I was trying to make sure that I had a way to continue to work in a studio. And I think that it's important to all of us with this material. It's not something you can easily do from home, but it's that time and that space. And it's that time where you're able to ask the questions for yourself. It's a lot of, I think that time alone in the studio is like it's really important to me. And just like keep growing, keep evolving. So always trying to come back. There's really never been a question for me, like, do I want to do anything else? Once I kind of got in that routine, I just have really wanted to stick with it. Maybe there's like a couple months where you get really frustrated and you need some time away, set like a break, but it's always pulled me back in.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and you both kind of mentioned the idea of questioning as part of why you're interested in making art. I am excited to talk about the fact that every time I give a tour of Figuring Space, I talk about this wonderful little grouping of, it's actually 3 images or sculptures, I should say. Oops, what's happening? Oh, I hate it when this happens. Can Christina on Zoom, do you see like the preview thing? Or
yeah.
just,
All right, you mean like the notes? Is that what you mean? Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna do this a different way. Oop. We're just gonna go like that. Okay. So these 3 sculptures, Chris's An Arm Bent Back, Christina Cordova's Eva 15, and Christina West's Discus Thrower, are this wonderful conversation exactly in classicism. And I have in my dreams of future exhibitions, classicism in clay, which I'm sure could come up with a better name at some point, has been on my list for like 5 years. So I feel like this is my mini version of that exhibition. And of course, although both of your works reference specific sculptures and Christina's doesn't, her work is so like essentially contrapposto, which is what the Greeks had sort of figured out at this moment and what really changed the face of art for the rest of the world and for the rest of our you know, humanity's time here. When we were talking with her the other day, I made this little slide of this progression of from the archaic period, because I'm an art historian and I got really excited about making a slide that probably nobody else cares about, but anyway. And I love the fact that they're in conversation and that each of you two have taken a work that is iconic and just completely shifted it in a way to make it your own, still recognizable, and yet adding in all these wonderful questions. So Chris is an arm bent. I don't know. Also, the fact that you are all named Chris something is interesting. I don't know what's going on there, but Chris is an arm bent back based on the Laocoon, and then although this is the wrong version, isn't it?
It's fine. Yeah. But it is not the version that I based the sculpture from.
Right, which we'll talk about in a minute. But and then Christina's is here. So I am going to, I guess, ask Christina to start by talking a little bit about why she chose the sculpture and what it means to you, Christina, and then how you decided to alter it to make it contemporary.
Yeah. Yeah, so the discus thrower is a classical sculpture that I've referenced in other works prior to this in video and other mixed media things. And it's a pose that I'm really interested in because it is so highly idealized. You know, we talk about that aspect of classical sculpture being idealized, and I think we usually talk about that in regards to just like the body type of like really strong muscular men. But this one is showing the body kind of performing in a way that is actually like really hard for the body to actually do. Like the artist for the original sculpture has taken liberties here to make sure that what he's showing is this perfect embodiment of balance and torsion and symmetry and things. And so it just seemed like a great piece to play off of that aspect with like highlighting the limitations of the body in reality. And so in previous pieces I've done things, yeah, like you're near it there. If you click on the arched piece, if you go down right there. Yeah, so the first piece I made with this body of work, I just asked the model to hold the pose and just saw how long he could hold it. And he actually never really was able to take the pose because it requires so much like twisting and turning of the body while muscles are engaged and everything like that. And then if you go down one more slide, the next piece I did was I made a structure to help support the model's body while he was holding the pose. And it was still incredibly difficult. Like they could only stay within this structure for like 3 or 4 minutes. And it was really difficult. So so the piece in the show is actually an evolution from this piece with the wooden structure where I wanted to have the fragments, instead of being life cast fragments as they are on the left there, have them be ceramic. And so they're less about replicating that specific model's body and highlighting the realism of the form, and more about like having my touch in the work and letting the clay be a little bit more expressive and highlight like a softness of the body and just a corporeality that is emphasized through the glaze, which shows like the skin in a way that looks a little bit more vulnerable, and things like that. And so the idea of the armature that was used to hold the model's body is then in the piece, the ceramic piece is translated into this metal armature, which becomes very scaffolding-like, and it suspends the pieces. And I feel like I'm getting off track here.
Sorry, I'm jumping around. I was
I'm
just
not
trying to show the
here. Yeah.
I liked your comment about the touch, the high touch sensitivity of your glaze, this new glaze work that you're doing.
Right. Yeah. So every time I switch mediums, I'm always asking the question, like, what can this medium do that the other ones can't? Like, I don't want to necessarily replicate the realism of a life cast in the ceramic work, because the ceramic work allows me to do different things than that. Like, there's no point in trying to translate the exact same thing with a different process and material. So when I started thinking about this work in relation to ceramics, the idea of inserting my touch became like very interesting to me, because that's something that it's harder to do with other mediums. And it's the thing that I think clay really excels at, is recording our touch really directly. And then also thinking about what glaze can do that other materials can't, so like historically, I shouldn't say historically because that sounds like forever ago, but like in the past, I've painted my work, and so like I felt like there was no point in glazing this if I was just gonna make it look like paint, again, like glaze can do things that paint can't do. So exploiting its ability to have these different textures, to be matte and shiny, to be translucent and opaque, and to kind of do unexpected things in the kiln. And so I just approached it much more differently than I had with earlier work, thinking about how I could really use these materials in a way that enabled them to do something unique.
Should I go to the next slide?
Sure. I didn't realize we were going through
my
original.
Just so that, it really, you're so perfectly talking about it that I can just
so
illustrate what you're saying.
Yeah. So when I started working this way with clay, it was during the pandemic, and I was doing a lot of glaze testing, and the way I handled the clay actually emerged from these glaze tests I was doing, because I was making these quick forms that were much rougher than my older work had been. They didn't have the smooth, refined, kind of articulated curves. And I started developing this palette of glazes that for them to work, it was really important that there were areas for the glaze to be thicker and thinner, high points, low points where it could pool. And so it kind of evolved from there. So it was sort of a backwards process, where usually in ceramics, you make a form and then you figure out later how to glaze it. And here I started with the glazes and then developed my thinking about what kind of surface the form would have, and then started developing them in tandem as well. It's not like it was a one and done sort of situation, but it did start with being excited about these glazes first, and then figuring out what kind of forms I could put them on.
And you could put them on body forms.
Yeah. So the upper left-hand picture here were some of the early fragments that I made, and I kind of didn't know what to do with them. Like in this show here, I lined them up sort of like the way you'd experience pedimental fragments in Italy or something. But I was more interested in allowing them to still have a presence that was more like the presence of a full body. And so that's where this next step with the discus thrower in the show came in, of creating a strategy for elevating the pieces and suspending them in space so that they could have a presence that was more closely aligned with a full body.
So I remembered when we first talked, when we had us, we were lucky enough to get to have studio visits, but usually by Zoom with the artists that we, Kelly and I had invited to the show. And I always kind of chuckle because I was expecting, this stuff.
Uh-huh.
And you showed us a picture of, I think, one leg with your new glaze on it.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk a little bit about, how it has, it's such a, they're still figures, but it's such a change. Do you find the questions, since we're talking about questions, the questions that you're answering or asking about the figure are different because in this new way, or how has it affected kind of methods?
Yeah, well, I will say with that older work, if you go to that slide with the green and pink, that actually isn't even clay. It was resin. I had moved away for a number of years from even having the final piece be clay because it didn't really make a difference, because the surface was just paint, and it didn't change the meaning at all for it to not be clay. But this work is with these fully articulated bodies. They were always tied to narrative. Like even when I wasn't telling an explicit story, and I would purposely keep the poses and gestures and expressions relatively open. There's something about seeing a fully rendered body that the first question is, what's he doing? And so I had kind of gradually become less interested in that aspect of the work. And so there was a stage between this and the newer fragments where I had taken some of these and fragmented them a little bit. I'd cut flat planes into them and orient them differently in space so that it became more about thinking of the body in a different way than questioning what the story was that was taking place. And so the fragment, I feel like, does that too, because you don't look at one of these fragments and think, what happened to his arm? We kind of understand the language of fragmentation in a different way.
Oh, okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so I'll turn to Chris, and then I'm going to ask both of you some similar questions. Do you want to talk a little bit about what this sculpture means to you and how you came to the piece that's in the show?
Yeah. When you had asked if I wanted to be in the exhibition, I don't really consider myself a figurative sculptor. I've made some figures in the past, but I was actually feeling very burnt out from working on figures. And then I thought, well, okay, yeah, I can do one more. And so I had made a series of sculptures for a show in Reading. It was a 2-person exhibition, and I wasn't really excited by the work. I don't think it's not even on my website. I haven't really posted it, so it's not really out there. And I was thinking of maybe I didn't have enough time to really develop that body of work, and that if I was going to continue and make one piece that would fit within that umbrella, what would it be? It had to have if it was one object, I really wanted there to be significant meaning behind it. And I immediately thought of Laocoon and his sons, which is at the Vatican. This is an illustration. I'm blanking on the artist's name, but I know that he was a cartographer and he depicted a lot of classical work. He was, I think, mostly illustrating and working within the 16th century. But I was thinking of this piece and how it had become very significant to me while I was in graduate school. We were reading a lot of theory this semester where I felt like there was a lot of growth and development and change, and a lot of there's huge stride within this one semester. And so the writing is it's on the limitations of painting and poetry by Gerhard Lessing. And so he's writing on the experience of what he defines as two separate ways of experiencing art, through visual work or work that exists in time. And so that could be like theater or poetry, and how the viewer comes to experience that, and how one art form could be perhaps experienced differently. So one is more for the collective, one is perhaps more for individual. And I was thinking of this sculpture. Do you want to go to the sculpture itself?
Mm-hmm.
So here's an image of the sculpture. So it was discovered in the 16th century within Rome. When it was uncovered, there was this huge ordeal. All of these thinkers and artists at the time came together. And so it really changed art at that moment. I think Michelangelo actually took time away from what he had been working on to spend time with this particular sculpture. And the writer, Gerhard Lessing, he's using this sculpture and also a poem that is about the same story to identify how these art forms are functioning. So the basis of the story, the story itself has never really been why I value the work. It's more how the translation evolves over time. But the basis is that Laocoon was going to warn the Trojans, or Troy, of the invasion by the Trojans. And a god sent down these serpents from the water, and they're coming and they're strangling. But even as soon as that idea, that story was created, there were alternative versions of how the story played out. So immediately we see that there's this shift in the narration, and over time that has continued to change. So the idea of the story changes, but then even how the work is depicted changes. And so when it was actually discovered, the arm was missing. You can see that there are still hands and arms missing on the two lower figures. And there was this huge debate on how it was to be depicted. So it's that idea of translation that I'm really, really interested in within the piece. So if you go to the next slide. So in the original sculpture, sorry, I should have printed this out before. The arm is actually bent back. Yeah, so you can see that the arm is bent back. And when it was discovered, the arm was actually missing, and you see here that the arm is reaching out up towards the sky. And so there was debate on how the figure was actually correctly going to be posed. So I based my piece off of a rendition that is in Denmark at the Copenhagen Museum of Art. I think that's the name. And so it's in this incorrect pose, and thinking of how that shift, and thinking of shifting it. And so I'm basing it off of a model that I referenced digitally rather than physically. So now when we think of art objects, they're more accessible through technology. They exist in these virtual collections that you can actually look at for free. You can maneuver the piece, you can zoom in, zoom out, actually move it around so you can see the backside, which is impossible to see if you go to the Vatican. And so in a way, it's far more accessible. Art objects that we, for most of history, had to go to, they can now come to us. And that accessibility is something that I'm really interested in and referencing. And so thinking of just that digital pool, how it's like actually coming from around the world for me, for all of us to be able to access it digitally, then I began to stretch and pull these figures. And then from the model, I referenced that to make it large by hand. Do you want to? Sorry, I feel like I'm.
No, that's why. That's fine.
This is it wrapped in plastic in my studio downstairs from where we are now. So I'm a resident here at the Clay Studio. There are 12 of us, one of 12 residents. I've been here now for 2.5 years. So I was at the old studio, now I'm here at the new studio. It's been amazing, I love it. And just even having level floors is completely game changing. I think if the old building, this would not have been possible because all of my work is on casters. So this is it wrapped up, and this is actually with the technicians who have been very helpful with seeing these larger sculptures.
I went to this one because it's on wheel. It's on the cart.
Yeah,
You were saying you couldn't have rolled it around
No.
if it was in the other building. I do love that picture. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
that's fine. So I think that I had made actually for the show and writing 5 or 6 works in this same technique where I'm pulling and shifting and stretching, but I didn't have the amount of time that I had with this piece. So this has really felt more successful. I actually based one of the sculptures off of the discus thrower as well, which was funny that was included.
Could I show the other?
Sure. So this is the finished state, and you could see that from that super pinchy technique of making, which we were both really interested in with clay, clearly, that the glaze isn't really covering it. It's more, I think, embellishing that touch. And so all makers who work with clay have their own touch. And that's something that I've always been really drawn to. In the past, I would try to find other ways of working. And so I would sometimes make tools for pushing into the clay to leave touch of a different type of mark, or I would use the back of a paintbrush. But I really want to express like it is directly from my hand. And I like that idea of it becoming physical, made by someone, and there's all these renditions that come through, and then that it goes through this digital state, and then it comes back and it's physical again. But part of it really is that most people can't come to the Clay Studio to see it. So by it existing digitally through this flatness, that is another iteration that I'm really interested in, and how perhaps people do come and see, and then it becomes a digital flattened copy that exists on their phone, taking up digital space in a different way. So it's these iterations that I think are really part of the work as well. The glaze, I really wanted it to feel like it was taking on time. I wanted it to feel like perhaps there was water falling on it, like rain collecting. You could feel like really that vertical movement of the glaze. And I was very lucky that worked out within the kiln firing. I had some testing, but not enough to really be certain of the end result. But I was really excited with how the glaze came out.
It's like a 600-pound test tile.
Yeah. I had to make it in 2 halves. You can see the divide kind of there in the middle because of the just the kilns, the space. It was so large that we actually had to alter the kiln slightly, but it came out. And I really liked that divide in half and really not hiding it. That was really important.
Well,
Hey, Chris, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm looking at the process photo that's a few up where it shows the 2 studio shots. And were you ever tempted to just leave it in 2 pieces like that?
Not like that, but I was considering, like, it felt like bookends in a way, like something belonged between them. And I was for some time considering to actually place the copy of the book that I had read from graduate school in between the 2 halves, but it was so beat up and torn that I had actually covered the spine in blue tape. And so it would have just been this block of blue instead of the actual like title being present. But I had considered that for some time, but I decided to not do it.
Well, I was asking because when I see it, especially the picture on the left, that edge, that abrupt edge, makes me think of digital space. Like it looks like a cropped image.
Yeah.
That does it even more so than the distortion from pushing and pulling, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really compelling when we're looking at it this way in this moment. But it's interesting because I think you were deciding about how to handle the break, and at one point, and we were maybe I shouldn't say this, we were rushing to finish the catalog, and so it exists in another, well, I'll say it's a good thing, it exists in another way, because in the
Yes.
catalog the image has been photoshopped so that you can't really see the break between the two things, because we weren't sure what to do.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to accept that as part of the piece, that the photo is different.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm fine with it.
I like the way I rationalize that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I was reading. No, I was listening to. Actually, that's a good picture for it. This New York Times podcast, The Daily. I think a lot of people listen to The Daily, but there was this story about the Miyazaki theme park that recently opened up, and there was this idea of the negative space, and there's this word for it in Japanese, and it's ma. And I've always been drawn to the space between things. So you can't see on Zoom, but between my phone and this glass of water, how there's like a relationship between. So with here, between the figures, between the serpent moving, that empty space is so important to me, and like in how I work. That's really been grounded in my practice for some time. And I just wanted to share that word. It felt like I had like hit onto like a moment of like, aha, like, oh, like I've been trying to figure out more of that idea of the empty space. And when I heard that yesterday, I was very excited by this term ma. So.
Yeah, it's very satisfying to find words in other languages that we just don't have in English.
Yeah.
Oh, I put these in different.
That's fine. There's a detail of one of the heads. And so when I work, it's really loose. I'm not trying to be exact. I push the clay around and tear it off. So it feels like lips, but I'm not really trying to sculpt lips. So it feels like there's the space of where the eyes go. You can tell it that they're there, but I'm not trying to really embellish and spend time on sculpting them perfectly.
I want to briefly ask both of you, when did you first encounter these two, the sculptures that you're basing these works on? And when you first encountered them, if it was in an art history class or in a book, was there something about that particular thing? And Chris has talked about this a little bit, but I still don't know when the first time you saw it was. So Christina, do you want to start by saying, like, what does the discobolus mean to you in terms of like when you discovered it as a student or as an artist?
Well, I can't remember if it was part of like my just general knowledge prior to this, because these images just kind of creep into our consciousness in various ways. They get appropriated by popular culture, and like you see them, and you don't always know necessarily their title or whatever. But I saw it in person, and when I was in Rome in like 2015 or so, I was teaching a workshop at Creator Rome, and we went to the museum where they had two versions of it there. And at the time, I was really drawn to it, took a lot of photos of it, spent a lot of time in front of it. And it was very beautiful. And I just thought it was interesting. And I was interested in the struts too. Like those are something that I've always been interested in, these ways that sculptors, work with the bodies that don't really have muscles that can support themselves. Yeah, it wasn't until I started working with models in the studio and creating video work that I returned to the sculpture and started thinking about the limitations of the actual body and what, how different it is than the way we see the body depicted in history.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you had seen it in person and if that was had a big impact, because there's, in terms of Western art, these really are things that exist, as you said, in popular culture as representing beauty and symmetry and what bodies are, supposed to look like, even though nobody's body really looks like that. And they're attractive for that reason. So it's interesting to me to that many people keep coming back to them. Do you want to talk about when you first saw that sculpture?
I think it would have been in the class. I didn't really have a lot of art history classes. I went to a really small school for undergrad, so I don't remember studying art history at that point, really. I was also able to see it in person when I did a residency at Creator Rome. I didn't get to spend a lot of time with it because the Vatican is very overwhelming with the amount of people. But I felt very fortunate to finally get to see that piece that I had become so drawn to during grad school. I had based some other previous work on that same sculpture, and now I feel like I do see it everywhere. It's one of those things like, oh, I think it's because I was so drawn to it. Now I feel like I constantly see it. I was looking at a Brancusi catalog, and he had modeled it early on in his career. So it keeps coming up now.
Yeah. Well, and they're both of these and many other Greek cultures just infuse, every era of art since then.
Yeah.
And because I see an empowerment in taking something that is a classical icon or an icon of, Western art history and altering it, because, you're applying your own story, your own questions, your own thoughts, and to change something that has an iconic status, I think is a way to remove its power in a way, or to allow your own power to speak. I don't know. Does it feel that way to you? I think, Christina, you've talked a little bit about like altering the male gaze to the female gaze. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, most of the work that we experience in art history was made by men for men. So it's interesting to me to, take these images and then be like, well, this is how I want to see it. Or this is a way of presenting it that isn't about just valorizing it, or turning it into a caricature of something, so that's, and I think I'm drawn to referencing the art history, because it gives an entry point into the work. There's a degree of familiarity that gives people something to like hold on to like enter into the work with, and I feel like we just kind of naturally do it anyway. Like we don't really create anything that's entirely new. So there's something nice about just acknowledging, like, look, I'm carrying on this tradition of things that have happened, but with this twist, I'm doing it in this different way.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to both like acknowledge that this has had impact, but also to apply our contemporary gaze, our contemporary issues, societal issues onto something in a way that makes it more relevant to more people. What do you think, Chris, about, the empowerment inherent in sort of changing this classical thing and making it your own?
Yeah. I haven't really thought of it, I guess, in that way as much of like making it my own necessarily. I think I'm more interested in it as like socially accessibility, and going back to how things are more accessible now through technology, I think was really a draw. Like my part of the decision making for me with selecting that sculpture, and being able to find multiple like renditions of the sculpture and find one or find them that they're all different. So there is no like true one anymore. They're all these other translations of the sculpture by other people. I think that's more why I was drawn to this one, is because it is so recognizable. It has been altered previously by so many countless people.
And in a way that has the same effect. In my mind, you're focusing and you're illustrating the idea that although we think of certain things as icons, it is not the original or, that one genius person who made that thing that makes it important. It's actually all of the people in between who altered it and thought about it and changed it and used it and referenced it.
Yeah.
So it's democratizing it in that way, in my view. I want to ask if anyone in the audience has any questions, and I'm also gonna warn you both that I want to ask you what you think about the two works being together in the space. And that's not fair to Christina because she hasn't been there in person, but
no, I saw it in person. I was there for the symposium.
Oh yeah, of course you did. Sorry.
Yeah.
See, it's been like 2 months and I've forgotten already. That it's weird because Chris wasn't here and you were.
Yeah.
This is a switch. Okay, so it's good. So you're not off the hook. You can think about it while other people are asking questions. Diana.
I'm really interested in the way you've shifted the sculpture, and I think we're used to it's part of our lives now. Things shift and elongate, and so on our cell phones we can look at something horizontally and vertically, and the thing changes completely.
Yeah.
And we're used to our own images being very strange things happening to our face.
Yeah.
And so I particularly loved that strange shifting thing that was happening, and I think we're bombarded with that now. And I mean, there are mirrors that are the round mirrors on the street that change images completely. So if you look in a steel kettle or something, you see a really strange image of a rock. So I love that about this particular.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really drawn to how images shift, how they're constantly being distorted. I feel like kind of referencing this artist Yuto Sterile in a way, like the thing is constantly uploaded and downloaded and the files distorts or they lose pixels. And so it's constantly being altered. And I like that idea of actually, so the poster for my studio, the picture of me, it's been downloaded so many times, it's actually kind of grainy, which it was like something I was like, oh, that's kind of funny, but that's like a part of art now because it exists digitally and it's not like a physical slide, right? So like the digital file is constantly, changing, which I am really drawn to.
And artists have been drawn to different shaped mirrors and things like that for many, generations too.
Unfair mirror.
Yeah.
Really
Well,
weird things before.
The marriage of the Arnolfinis.
It's really hard to hear the questions on Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at the typing. It was coming through. Sorry.
Oh, I'm not doing I should do the closed captioning, I guess.
Sorry.
I've
I
never
just
done
assumed
that.
that meant that you'd be able to hear it. Apologies. Yeah, Diana was just talking about the relationship between Chris's piece and the way we look at our phones all the time and can alter view and stretch the images and change
Right.
over time.
Yeah.
All right. Raymond's going to ask a question and I will repeat it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'll ask both artists. How big is the original?
How big is the original? Big, super big. Life size, bigger than life size? It's close to life size. Yeah, I think they're all.
Did you hear?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I said I would repeat it and I didn't. Yes, I thought I did. Are they how big is the original sculpture? Isn't it life size?
It's about life size.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, a little small, maybe just a touch smaller than like what we'd consider life size, but close in that range. Yeah.
People were shorter then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm curious, kind of for both of the artists, how did you decide how to stretch it? And then how did you actually do that, like while you were sculpting it? Like what was the, I don't know, were you like following a particular sketch or did a manipulation you made? Or like were you stretching it as you sculpted it, anything? And same with like Christina, how did you decide where to cut off the parts?
How did you decide where to cut off the parts? Like how did you decide how to alter and choose? I'll let you go first and then because I'm gonna pull up a picture for Chris's.
Okay. I feel like with that pose, the legs are really important for, like, I feel like when I was looking at the piece, that was the part of the sculpture that I focused on a lot. Is where there's a lot of interesting stuff going on formally. And I feel like it's just integral to like understanding the pose, having, you know, a little bit of what's going on with the legs there. And then I wanted like a mid section, and then I chose like a shoulder neck area because I needed a part that was at the top of the body so that it would kind of stretch out and suggest a complete figure. But I didn't want that. I like the idea that last fragment wasn't, it's in some ways it's a more intimate part of the body. Like you don't really look closely at the crook of someone's neck, you know, publicly very often. But it's also kind of nondescript, you know, like it's usually we emphasize like a face or maybe hands or, you know, parts of the body that have what we consider more like more ability to communicate what's going on inside the body. So I like those qualities of that weird shoulder section. Yeah.
And it really, if you don't understand what it is, if you see it by itself, it's very confusing. You're like, what is this thing? Even when we were putting it together, we were like, is it upside down? Like what's happening? And then like you're saying, it's a very intimate spot. Great, thank you. And then Chris has this as part of his answer.
Yeah. So when I began to actually stretch and pull, I downloaded the file and then I uploaded it to a program called Rhino, which I know very little about. I can use it just enough to get by, basically. And where I work at the University of the Arts, they have plastic 3D printers. And I kept, when I download it, the amount of polygons, it actually becomes so overwhelmed and I can't tell what is happening. So I tried several iterations until I found one that actually I thought I could even get away with sculpting. And so it was pulling and stretching, but I couldn't really tell what was happening from it becoming flat, and your mind wants to correct that, wants to correct the stretch. And so it was, I think, the fourth one that I thought, oh, this feels right. And it feels like still recognizable, but you can tell like it is definitely incorrect. And then from there, when I printed it, and I had decided, I knew that it had to be in half because of just the kiln size. If it were one object, it would have been fairly small. And I realized that it still wouldn't fit. And so I actually had to cut. And so the one on the right, I actually cut off and glued closer, right?
This part?
Yeah, it was overhanging much further. And so I distorted it analog also.
Cool. Okay, Patrick has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris, Christina, and Jennifer. This has been great. My question is for Christina. It kind of maybe riffs off of what Chris was saying with the way that we view images on these screens. I was lucky enough to see your installation at the Mattress Factory a few years ago, and I think a lot of the work that I'd seen of yours was on these screens, these digital mediums, and I thought of you much more of just like, I never really thought of these installations or these much larger setups that we've seen some more examples of today. And I'm curious, that just felt so. I don't know, there's something really different and unique about that specific installation. And I'm curious about how you think about like sort of freestanding sculpture versus installation. I mean, do you go into something, feeling like this has to be an installation or this is one singular sculpture? How do you approach that kind of decision-making process?
Yeah, I mean that's partially dictated by the opportunity. So the figurine space show is presented as a show where you make one figure, and it would be a grouping of these figures in the space. And so I focused on my composition within that was a contained piece, and I've been working that way a little bit more lately. And with the installations, that starts out as someone saying, I have this space. Do you want to do something in this space? So I'm thinking much more about how like the composition just expands essentially, from the contained composition of what fits on the pedestal versus like what fits in the room and how it's going to be displayed in the room, and thinking about how people are going to move through the space and see how their body is going to feel as they're going through a short doorway or a tight hallway or standing next to a tiny figure. And so with the singular piece and figurine space, I'm still thinking about like, how are people going to feel standing next to an object that towers over them, and is, it seems somewhat precarious because it's just like sitting on this pipe and things like that. So it's similar concerns, but it's dictated by just the opportunity itself, So I wouldn't have thought to say to Jennifer, like, yes, but I'm going to do an installation.
Other people, you did still break the rules, but
yeah, really? How so?
Well, we asked for full-scale figurative sculpture, which I guess it is, but in my mind, it was like if everything had a head.
Oh, yeah, you should have said
But you're
that.
not the only one. And I did have somebody who asked about more like installation and then changed their minds. So I'll just add as the curator, it's okay to push back sometimes. Also, that being said, your piece it's more installation-y than some others because you created the base. Mm-hmm. So it's really self-contained. Like Jonathan Christensen Caballeros also had that pedestal mm-hmm. that's integral to the piece. And I also think I'm really interested in the fact that you put casters on the bottom of the mm-hmm. pedestal, which it implies movement. It implies mm-hmm. that it could be, moved mm-hmm. into another space. I never asked you what made you make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, there was something about the scaffolding structure that seemed a little like it implied something improvisational, like it was hoisted up temporarily or something. And so the idea that the platform itself could also be moved, I thought was interesting in relation to that idea. And then the wheels and the movement relating to the movement of the sculpture of like a body twisting and turning. So it related in that way, and it fit in with the construction material aesthetic of the armature and the platform and everything. Yeah. But I'm interested in your comment that a figurative sculpture needs to have a head. What's that about?
I mean, it's true. A lot of the Greek sculptures don't have their heads anymore. Chris didn't follow the rules because his is not full scale.
Mine is also 3 figures.
It's also 3 figures. I mean, it's the fact that many people didn't. I mean, I'm the curator, I have an idea, but it's intentionally a conversation with the artists and a collaboration with the artists because people interpret what your, mm-hmm. request is in their own way. So it's tongue in cheek when I say you broke the rules. I mean, Rob Lugo made a teddy bear, also right. Not a figure.
Yeah.
We're not a human figure. And then there's a 2-headed. Yeah. Anyway, it is those moments. And then Victoria doesn't have a torso or a head. So it's a good thing that people aren't following the rules. That's why you're artists and I'm a curator. I'm a rule follower. So I make them and you break them. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Now,
you may already have discussed this before I came in, because I did come late. But when I saw that was in pictures, but especially in person, my reaction was, besides the technical bits about the extraordinary sculpture itself, were the emotions depicted. The father and the son struggling against this extraordinarily powerful serpent, and the fear, the agony, the struggle against this creature. I mean, to me, that would have been my starting point. But for both of you, because I haven't heard anything about emotions yet.
Yeah.
Was any of that part of what you thought when you saw it, or when you were making it?
The question, Christina, is about the emotion, and whether the emotion of the sculpture is connected, because we've been talking so much about technical and kind of formalism. What does the emotion of that original sculpture, and then how you altered it, I guess, mean to you?
The original sculpture doesn't have a lot of emotion in it. He's pretty collected and just like enacting this impressive feat of athleticism very calmly and smoothly. His face doesn't really show any strain or anything. It's like kind of an example of just like the body performing through athleticism. Not like Chris's piece where there's like agony and dread, and there's much more emotion in that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the book he's writing about that quite a bit, and the sculpture is capturing those emotions right the moment before the peak of the climax in the narrative of the story. And that was like something I had thought about when I was reading the book. I didn't bring this up, but it became much more personal in this past year, where my father was very sick, and I actually have a brother, and I was thinking about that a lot while working on this sculpture. And so my father passed away like right at the end of making the piece, actually. So it was a really weird emotional thing where all through the fall, it was something that I was working through while I was actually working through the sculpture. So, yeah.
It's actually really interesting to think about the way fathers and sons are depicted in art history, because there's this sculpture, and then there's Count Ugolino and his sons, which is about like him contemplating having to eat his sons to survive. And then like the sacrifice of Isaac, like there's so much violence in the relationship depicted, if you think about that in contrast to the way Mary with Christ is shown, like, in a loving manner.
Yeah,
I know you're not
absolutely
interested in that, Chris, but I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, that I hadn't thought about Ugolino and his sons. That whole, like, he's got that, his face and his hand is so stretched. Thank you for that question. That's an important thing. I could talk for another half an hour, but we're already 11 minutes over, which we don't usually do. It's just such a great conversation. Let me just make sure no one's said anything in the chat. Oh, well, we definitely don't have time to get into that question about the Michelangelo. I did read about that. I can't even, I don't know how to, I don't know. It's horrible. Okay, thank you so much for being with us. This we recorded, and it will be available probably next week if you want to share it with people, and just has been an inspiring and now my moment of joy is this conversation for the day. So thanks to you both. I hope you have a great day, Christina.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for being with us.